speed.
Saul, when you were first coming to Washington in 1933, what did you think about that? What did you think the NRA was going to do?
Well, the country was very much troubled. Every group in the society, from the richest, the most powerful, to the common man, and to the most deprived, were all uncertain as to what the future would be. There was a sense that a new administration was coming in, and that would bring a new world into being. And young men like myself, living in New York, felt this new impulse. And many of us thought that we'd like to play a part in this major scene of rescuing the world and our country. And we knew of these hunger camps of the unemployed, the marches of the unemployed. We knew of the hunger about, and we were all praying, everybody, from the most powerful, as I suggested, to the person in the most resigned and forsaken positions, were hoping that a new life was ahead of us. And, of course, the great call to each one of us, young people, was to join the parade and do our bit in this function. So it was those of us who had any social concern were very quick to respond to this call.
What was your first job with the New Deal?
My first job, and actually my only job, because I came in July 1933 and I left in February 37, and the name of the organization with which I was associated was changed 3 or 4 times. Well, the basic organization was the National Industrial Recovery Administration, the Blue Eagle. This was the organization of industrial revival and labor revival, and revival was the word. Reemployment was the battle cry, and well, as a young man, our place in the world was to help, and those of us who had dreamt of it just responded.
I'm just
Now, you were representing labor in the New Deal. Could
Well,
you describe that?
I mean, that is partially true, but it doesn't really describe the role which we were placed. In the NIRA, there were 3 advisory committees to General Johnson, who was the administrator. Now, I was employed in the Labor Advisory Board, which consisted of representatives of the trade union movement. And our function was to advise the administrator on the labor terms of the codes of fair competition. Under the system which evolved, industry management submitted proposals for the codes. The administrator held public hearings, and our function was to advise the administrator as to whether the terms of the labor terms of the code conformed to the purposes of the code, and that became a very serious contest, because you must understand that the trade union movement was very weak. It was absent from most industries, and the staff of the board, in effect, of which I was a member and became assistant director, in time, our responsibility was to aid trade unions in presenting their case, or where there were no trade unions or inexperienced leadership, was to offer them advice and counsel, as well as to present our views as to what the terms of employment should be. And then, behind the screens, so to speak, we bargained with the administrator to be sure that the terms were adequate. And of course, our bargaining power was very limited because the trade union movement was very weak. And the consequence is that we were constantly engaged in negotiations with the administrator in trying to secure the most favorable terms, labor terms of the codes.
Now, you could tell us then about the textile code, which was the first.
That's right. Now, the textile code, the cotton textile code, was the first adopted, and the industry was very much in favor of this code, or such a code. The reason for it was that the Depression had had a very destructive effect on industry, many bankruptcies, people were displaced, and prices dropped very severely, and they were seeking various ways of achieving stability, which was the word of the time. And they hoped that the NRA would help them. And they drafted a code, submitted it to the administrator, and it became the guideline for all the other 500 some odd codes which were subsequently adopted.
Now, talk about the labor part of that code.
Well, the labor commitment and the contents of the code were generally provided for a minimum wage. In the first code for textiles, it provided a minimum wage of $12 for the South and $13 in the North. That would seem, in terms of our present levels, rather outlandishly low, but you must understand that at the time there were many mills that were paying $4 and $5 a week for a 54-hour week. Now, the second thing that the code contained was a 40-hour week, which became the standard. And then there were all kinds of miscellaneous provisions. One was, for example, the prohibition against child labor at 16, below 16. There were provisions for safety and health codes written into the act, and those were and of course, most outstandingly was what was called Section 7A, which provided that workers had a right to organize, to select their own representative, and the employers were not to interfere with their organization or nor coerce them in any way, affect them, that the workers' organization should be workers' organization thoroughly, who would counterpose management in bargaining. The word which became very popular was countervail. The unions, the workers' representatives would countervail the monopolistic power of the management in the formulation of the terms of labor.
Now, we have had a whole series, hundreds of letters from textile workers protesting against not getting the right wages, not getting the right hours, and also being denied the right to have a unions. Why all those letters if it was written into the code?
Why these were letters written into the code?
If all of these provisions were written into the code, why did all those textile workers protest?
Yeah. Now, of course, they were written, those letters, many of them were written before the code was adopted. Secondly, there were many employers who didn't comply with the terms of the code. The workers were looking for help from the national administration to enforce the code. You must gain a insight into the spirit of the time. Roosevelt was the Messiah, and particularly in the textile industry, they all were looking for him to lead them into a new promised land, and they wrote him, and as you suggest, there were hundreds and thousands of letters about the breaches by individual employers all through the country of the terms of these codes, and they wanted relief. And the question basically was that the relief was really in the hands of the code authority, which was manned completely by employers, and that was under the terms of the code. And therefore there was no sympathetic response. The letters were just shunted aside, and the result was many workers felt frustrated and disappointed and rebellious, and those were the without relief from any side. Of course, you must understand also that the same attitudes or similar attitudes prevailed throughout the country in all other industries. The period of 1933 and 34 are periods of historically high, large number of strikes, bitter strikes, prolonged strikes, strikes in which workers were defeated in many instances by the militia, and the National Guard were called out by the governors of these various states. The entire industrial relations system had collapsed, and there was no easy answer immediately or help to these people.
Was there no enforcement arrangement for the code for 7A?
Well, later that began such enforcement appeared, but at the beginning, all of the violations had to be sent to the code authorities, and of course, the code authorities, with very few exceptions, and these were exceptions where there were real strong unions, like the mine workers and others, they rejected them, dismissed them, and there were no answers.
I'm going to ask you to do that again, but not say about the miners, because we need it tight, you see. Question. Yeah. Were there no enforcement authorities?
There was the only enforcement authorities that were were the code authorities. And the members of the code authorities were almost uniformly, exclusively employers. And of course, they were unwilling to acknowledge that the worker had any rights to complain.
Now, we have heard from so many textile workers that they loved Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And they said that Roosevelt said they should join a union. Did you ever hear of Roosevelt? Where did they get that idea?
Well, it was a free interpretation of the language of the NIRA. And when they said Roosevelt, they really meant the Congress of the United States plus Roosevelt. But in a short shibboleth, they assigned all the responsibility to Roosevelt himself. And many of the slogans of the day were formulated in those terms. It was Roosevelt, the Messiah, who wanted us to join unions. And of course, union leaders and organizers and people, organized people, carry that message far and wide.
You'll be amused to know that when we recorded somebody saying Roosevelt got on the radio and said, you should join a union. I went through 12 volumes of Roosevelt's speeches and I couldn't find it. And you've explained why.
Yeah, yeah.
Very good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Could you again explain the role of the textile industry in creating the code and the kind of the kind of power that they had in constructing this code and their excitement at being able to do so if you thought they had.
But talk to me when you do that.
But be specific to the textile industry.
Yeah. As I've indicated, the entire administrative structure of the NIRA was in the hands of the employers, except for the few codes where there were union representatives, and invariably they were not very sympathetic to the complaints which were being filed, and nothing happened. Later on, people could file complaints with the local representatives of the NIRA, but they too were not very numerous or adequately policed. And there were some cases which were brought, but hardly sufficient to correct the resistance which existed in management toward the government standards which in effect were developed with management for each one of the codes.
Now, you were in Washington when the textile code was delivered or developed. Did you ever meet Mr. Anderson or Donald Comer or any of those people?
I personally didn't. Actually, the textile code was adopted about a week and a half before I signed my commitment to the NIRA, so I had nothing to do with the code itself, with the enactment of the code.
Now, you recall the 34th strike.
Yes.
That wonderful, terrible 3 weeks. Could you just tell us how you felt at the time and how you felt about the resolution of it?
Well, I was, during that period...
Tell us which period.
The period of the strike of September 1934. I was then a government employee who by that time I'd become assistant director of the Labor Advisory Board, and I was in charge of the staff guiding them. So my knowledge was largely in guiding and steering and advising and aiding the person on my staff who was acting as the official government labor advisor on the code. And so that I got my communication and knowledge of what was happening and the complaints which subsequently were filed from this person.
Now, do you recall the strike itself and the news that was coming in and the excitement or the worry?
Oh, yes. It was the most dramatic event short of war because there was no precedent for it in American history. The people estimate that there were more than 400,000 people on strike. And not only were there so many, but they occurred largely in 3 different sections of the country, primarily in New England, the Middle Atlantic, and the southeastern states. An unheard of event in American history where workers revolted. There's no denying it was a revolt, but you must also understand that concurrently there were similar revolts of a local nature or more local nature in many other industries, in the mining industry, in Toledo in the auto industry, in Minneapolis in the trucking industry, in San Francisco and the West Coast on the longshore industry. And these were, and together with the 34 strike, were real war. People were killed in the midst of these. The National Guard were called out in in New England and in the South, and open fire was declared against the strikers, and many were killed. Of course, the numbers look puny when just as numbers, but here were civilians exercising the normal expected right to strike who were hounded and shot down and injured, and it created a tremendous sense of internal turmoil during those few weeks.
How did you feel?
Huh?
How did you feel?
How did I feel? Well, actually, to me, I was sitting in Washington, and the result is that I responded largely in terms of how we could help bring about a settlement for the strike and see whether we couldn't correct conditions. And many suggestions went to Roosevelt in order to help to suggest ways in which to solve this problem.
Now, Madam Perkins took some action there. Were you privy to what was happening there?
No, she sent her recommendations to the president at the time, like many of us. For example, my recommendations were forwarded to the chairman of the Labor Advisory Board, who was my immediate superior, and they were forwarded on to the president, and he made his choices. I presume you've heard about the fact that the president appointed 2 boards, that is two successively. One where Mr. Bruyere was a mediator and who accomplished nothing, and then one by Mr. Governor Wynant of New Hampshire as a chairman of a second board in September, and the latter finally submitted recommendations which the president adopted and which brought an end to the strike.
Now, when the strike was ended, Gorman called it a great victory, and yet the workers went back the next Monday, and many of them were blacklisted.
Yes.
And Could you just talk about that?
Yes. The cotton textile industry dismissed the terms of the president's order, which required them to re-employ people. We know there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were never re-employed, and the United States Chamber of Commerce, for example, issued leaflets and brochures describing how they could circumvent the terms of this presidential order, so that they didn't have to hire anybody but those whom they preferred to recruit. And of course, they were prohibited from discriminating against leaders of the strike at the local level. But of course, that was furthest from their mind. The victims ran into thousands. And even to this date, if you move in among the Southern textile workers' families, there are many, many who tell the story of how they had been ostracized, and many tell the story of how they had to leave the South and seek employment in other areas of the country, so that the experience left a great scar in the minds and memories of the people living in the textile South.
How do you think Roosevelt felt about that?
Well, I can't tell you. I'm not privy to anything personal from Roosevelt. Roosevelt, throughout this early New Deal period, very, on the whole, had to respond to the opposition of employers, which antedated the strike and antedated the NIRA, and he had to listen to the unions and to his advisors who favored new solutions. And very often he resolved it by executive order, which happened to favor the union. Often he avoided it. So you know, the general feeling was that despite
people like Callaway's and Comers and that kind of people,
all right,
who
I would say,
hold it, we have to wait till. Okay, tell us about Roosevelt and the end of the strike.
Yeah. Well, Roosevelt, on September 22nd, 1944, those were the...
Sorry, it was 34. Let's
34.
Start again.
34.
Start again. Roosevelt, go.
Roosevelt, on September 22nd, 1934, issued a executive order reflecting the recommendations of the Why Not Board of how to settle the strike. By and large, the violations and avoidance of the terms of the order by management was real widespread, created many, many victims. They didn't rehire thousands of them. And as is known, if you travel through the South and talk to people and families about it, of the number of people who left the area to go to other parts of the country. Now, Mr. Roosevelt, during this entire period, was faced by many, many industrial relations disputes. And he, of course, had many advisors. There was Perkins, General Johnson, etc. And members of Congress, particularly Senator Wagner of New York State. And on the other hand, there were pressures from management and the conservative forces in the country. And there were all kinds of issues which came up, all of them urgent, all of them involving thousands of people, all of those involved in challenging the rights of the property interests, the management interests in this country. And he's an elected official and consequently had to find his way through this morass of conflict. By and large, he was very helpful to the trade union movement. Very many instances, for example, in the negative sense, where local officials and governors asked for the National Guard to be sent in, he would turn to the conciliation service, mediation service, for advice of the conditions, and then decided not to send the National Guard. It must be tens and tens of cases where that was true. Now, of course, management, Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, the conservative forces kept prodding him and forcing him and threatening him and describing horrible cases. One governor from Rhode Island even described what was happening as a revolution and asked for a National Guard. And he denied them those requests, but he was trying to find some way of resolving a very bitter and tense situation. Sometimes, of course, his decisions didn't favor the immediate tactical advantages for the worker or the union. But in that type of bitter conflict, you're going to hurt one or the other when you make a decision. But on the whole, obviously, the unions came out much stronger because of the attitudes that he did take during this period.
Now, this is taking us much, much further down the line. But if the textile strike had succeeded, or even gained the right for people to organize, what difference do you think it would have made to the development of the South then and the South now?
Yeah. Well, that's asking to construct a future which never took place. One must recognize that the South, during the last 5 years, particularly, and subsequently, has and will be really reorganized economically. Areas like Texas, which were barren deserts, are sources of wealth. New industries are locating there. And the same thing is happening in the southeast in the textile states, like North and South Carolina, foreign countries. The most dramatic, of course, is the advent of the German auto plants in these Carolinas. So that there was an imminent drive. As a matter of fact, you might be interested, is that during the war, when the textile union was trying to organize, and we were seeking for new ways of overcoming the resistances and the indifference of the political systems of the South, I, for one, suggested various programs of economic development which would foster the industrialization of the southeastern states, such as I've just said, had occurred during the last 5-7 years. So the great problem in the South is that the population had been poverty-stricken for years. Their educational standards were low. The political and social system was dominated by a few interests, particularly the textile moneyed interests, and there was no drive to get new investments. As a matter of fact, we have many, many cases where an existing textile community would resist new industries lest they bring in a higher wage scale. So that we had not yet initiated a nationwide system of encouraging enterprise and new industries. As a matter of fact, I might just another personal feature of it. I was at that time, as I still am, a member of the board of the National Planning Association, and observing how backward the southeastern states were economically, proposed that we undertake a study to delineate courses of action which would rehabilitate or create new industries in the South. This was in about 47, 48, I believe it was. At that time, there was not too much support for it from the governing interests of the South. Now that attitude has changed and has helped promote further industrialization, so that my general observation was that particularly in areas like the southeastern states, unions can function very constructively in prodding the political authorities and the economic authorities to initiate new developmental programs. And the fact that the established interests in these areas resist new industry would be overcome by a counterforce. Countervailing force is the word we often use, which would offset the conservative, restrictive interests of established capital. And this is in all backward areas need that kind of condition. Okay?
Okay.
We had a similar problem in later years in the textile industry. In 1960, the union sought ways in which to accelerate the innovations within the industry in order to offset the increasing competitive threat from abroad. And we proposed in Congress that the industry, that Congress appropriate money to help such innovations. The President Kennedy in May 61, endorsed this program, and Congress adopted it. I think it was $750,000 to conduct the research, and the research committee was established for that purpose. I was appointed the labor member of that research effort, but we never got very far, because the big manufacturers who represented management on that committee thought that was not the function of government. And the result was that our effort and the money we spent bore no fruit.
I'm gonna go back. We're gonna cover some of the same ground that we've done already. But I want you to remember that some of the folks that are going to be listening to this, imagine that you're talking to people who don't know some of the basics. So I'm going to want you to like what the NRA was supposed to do. Some some basic information.
Yeah.
So because a lot of just recount and short that in July of 1933 you came to Washington as a new dealer on the heels of the NRA coming in, and what you felt what you in your mind the NRA was supposed to do.
Well, the title of the agency, NIRA, Recovery Administration, was to stimulate the economic recovery of this country. I've already suggested that the nation was in very dire economic circumstances, and the people obviously was suffering greatly. And Roosevelt was elected to bring these changes. Now, the major effort that the NRA sought was to, from the point of view of labor, was to shorten work hours and raise wages to a more decent level, minimum wage level. And management, on the other hand, had a different sort of goals. Theirs was the goal of establishing stability, which meant to them people didn't cut each other's throat in setting prices, and they didn't build up excessive inventories. And the result of that was that the codes, besides having labor provisions in them, had provisions regulating commercial practices. And these commercial practices, which were forbidden under these codes, were all designed, were all intended to cut prices and to build excessive inventories and to destroy competitors. And the code provisions sought to correct those conditions.
Okay, now it seems like one of the definitions of the NRA that there was going to be a partnership between industry and government and working people. Am I right?
Well, that term partnership is
just stop for a second.
Is a very
That when did it become obvious to you that the textile code that the employers weren't that the workers were not being responded to?
And also, maybe we want to talk.
now
What was the idea of the strike? I mean, did he
you
say
see the
strike?
code approved in July 33, and complaints continued to be filed. The union began to grow in size
Yes,
as
let's hold it because that's exactly what we want. So roll and you start the code in 33.
Start over.
And we got start over and we'll record this.
all right.
Roll it.
The code was approved by the president,
Can you say the textile code?
yes,
Okay.
in July 1933. And shortly
Could you
thereafter,
start, I'm sorry. Could you start again? The textile code was approved in 1933.
the Cotton Textile Code was approved in July 33, and complaints of nonconformance and stretch out and loss of wages were beginning to be filed. and these were filed and were sent to the Cotton Textile Authority, which, as I've indicated, was an exclusively employer-manned committee. The result was great dissatisfaction was common, and threats of strikes were taking place throughout the industry. As indicated by the fact that the union membership multiplied during this period, people were looking for outlets for their dissatisfaction. Now, the most extraordinary thing happened in Alabama, where spontaneously the local unions in Alabama, I think it was about 10 or 12 local unions at the time, declared a strike in August, I think it was, 1934. But widespread dissatisfaction because two things. First, employers in many cases didn't pay the minimum wages. Secondly, these people had been working 50, 54 hours a week, and all of a sudden their hours were reduced to 40. So their pay, even though the individual rates of pay per hour were raised, the total earnings per week were cut in many cases. And the employers at the same time sought to overcome the rise in cost of production, where they were complying with the code. So they undertook what is called by the textile workers the stretch out, which means that workers would have to attend a larger number of machines under their control. Now, all of this wreaked great havoc with the morale and people, and you had stoppages. So much so that in one state, Alabama, I think it was about 20 mills, unionized mills, just went out on strike of their own without getting permission from anybody, just because the heat of disgust and abuse had just risen to such a level that the workers did themselves, went out and conducted a strike, began the strike. And the spirit, and then also the fact, as I've recited, the strikes in other industries which was taking place all over the country, of course, sort of gave sanction to the workers in the South that they too had a right to strike and to get correction. And that increased the fury and the heat and the temper of Southern workers.
Now, there was a belief in the South that particularly textile workers wouldn't join unions.
Yeah.
And there was a belief in other parts of the country that the South was safe from unions. Surely there must have been a great surprise when suddenly all of these people came out. Could you talk about that?
Well, surprise was really there, but that didn't change their attitude any. It merely meant that they resorted to more severe repression during this period. People were fired, ringleaders were weeded out, and throughout the area, as well as in New England, the kind of recrimination was extraordinary. So it was an unprecedented experience about which the employers in the South had to learn and to come through.
Now, here were you yourself surprised at this? I mean, you were watching all of this, I know, from Washington.
Yeah.
So when you saw all these Southern textile workers organizing local unions at such a great rate, what did you think about that?
Well, one react. So how do you help? How do you resolve this problem? That, as I've reported, many different groups, including myself and my agency, forwarded recommendations as to what the president should do. This was much beyond the power or of any single part of the government. It had to be done by the president.
This surprise at Southern Unionism, I'm wondering if prior to the strike, if you recall, you yourself or your colleagues being surprised at the militance of the Southern workers.
Well, we were surprised.
Could you say we were surprised that they were joining unions? You have to include some of my question in your answer, so we can keep it in context.
We were surprised that the Southern worker who had endured these conditions for decades would rise so unanimously and widespreadly to protest. But the surprise it was merely a further incentive for all of us to seek new answers. And the only power in the Washington setup for taking action is the president, because each one of our agency are circumscribed in the initiatives that we can take.
Now, what's ironic is that the industry, set up these codes and set up these rules, and then they didn't follow the very thing that they set up, and that's a hard.
No, you see, it's not you have to recall how the codes were adopted. The employers, generally speaking, with very few exceptions, initiated the process. They drafted the code. They were required to put certain provisions in the code, not that they liked them, and they just had to. They couldn't get their provisions in unless there was Section 7A and the labor provisions of the code, so that they were very lukewarm, as I've indicated repeatedly. They were very lukewarm, and in fact I would say they were cold to these complaints which were coming in, and they dismissed them as just rattle of these nitwits who are our employees.
Now, how was it that they also got to become the code authority?
What's that?
I understand they drafted the code, but why is it that the industry also became the code authority?
That's right.
But why? I mean, how is it that they could draft it and then they could become the code
Well,
authority?
the whole NRA was a compromise developed by by Roosevelt of trying to meld and unite both management and unions in support of this legislation. And he had to give management certain rights, which they didn't have before, and he had to give unions or labor certain rights, which they didn't have. So this compromise was something that the management had to swallow, but that obviously they were very half-hearted about the idea of enforcing the labor provisions of the code.
Now, how do you imagine that the textile workers thought about Section 7A and that labor provision? How did they read that section of the code?
Well, to the workers generally, it was an invitation to organize and to establish unions in the industry, and but the employers did willingly concede, and therefore there was constant discrimination against people who took the initiative to establish unions, and discrimination against them.
Could you say that again, because I think we've got something above it.
Well, the unions, the employees sought to organize, and where they succeeded, they then met the employers' resistance. For example, the union won many, I recall during the first 2 years of the organization, the union won something over 50 elections, for which they never consummated agreements with employers, because the employers resisted and wouldn't agree. And there was no real judicial system for enforcing the codes. And that's one of the great weaknesses which existed in the early NIRA, was the absence of tools for enforcement. And it was only when the Wagner Act was adopted in 1937 that such policing authorities were granted to the new National Labor Relations Board. So that during the 4 years, from 33 to 37, all an agency could do was to remove the Blue Eagle and from a company which violated, and of course that was not a very severe penalty to pay for gaining an absence of a union.
Could you hold it up just a minute? You're such a
That's very
key
important.
statement.
Yeah.
And I just want to make it absolutely right.
Excuse me a moment.
Yeah.
It just shows sometimes minds. All right. The Wagner Act, these judicial and administrative powers were for the first time granted to the administration under the Wagner Act, which was passed in 1935 and became operative then. One of the reasons reasons for passage of the Wagner Act was the realization that management was not going to do this voluntarily, and that there had to be some tools for enforcing and penalizing violators, and those were provided for in the Wagner Act.
Good.
Copy
Thank
this? Yeah, sure.
Okay.